Tonight, I want to start the show by focusing on one number and a lot of questions. As it now stands, Donald Trump sits with about 74 million votes nationwide compared to 70 million votes for the Vice President Kamala Harris. It is safe to say those numbers will change as more votes are counted. But compare these numbers to 2020. On the strength of the highest voter turnout in recent American history, the Democrats won more than 81 million voters, while Trump was at 74 million, a number very close to what he won in Tuesday's election. And whether that number ends up being 5 or 10 million less than in 2020, my first question is an obvious one. What happened to those voters? For the most part, Trump matched and slightly increased his number, but the Democrats fell short of theirs. How did the party lose them? Why did so many stay at home? There's a big debate happening right now in the Democratic Party. Some say it is the focus on trans issues. Others say the party moved too far in one direction or the other. Some point to specific issues like the war in Gaza. The reality is there is no single one issue that we can point to explain the results in its entirety. But we do have some glimpses into key races that can shed some light. Take, for example, Michigan. Harris lost to Trump by about 78,000 votes. But Democratic Senator-elect Elise Slotkin defeated her Republican opponent by 21,000 votes. As former Democratic staff Hamid Bendayes pointed out on X, Slotkin, while a big supporter of Israel, did in fact express a willingness to condition U.S. aid if it kept restricting aid to Palestinians, something that the Harris campaign never wanted to do. Was that enough to swing Michigan? Certainly something to consider. As happens every election cycle, there is a cottage industry that immediately blamed the progressives and says that the party had moved too far to the left. And that's a ridiculous argument for many reasons. The Democratic campaign spent its closing weeks with its candidate touring Liz Cheney. She was with Liz Cheney and touting the endorsement of Dick Cheney. And while Trump and his movement spent the campaign firing up its base with red meat and making sure they got out and voted, Democrats were, once again, chasing the mythical moderate swing voter. And it's not just the Cheneys. For all the talk of Democrats, once the party of the working class, now losing ground with those voters of all races to Trump, take a look at this New York Times headline from mid-October, how Wall Street is subtly shaping the Harris economic agenda. The vice president has repeatedly incorporated suggestions from business executives into her economic agenda. And now, after the election, Harris had a Wall Street-approved economic pitch. It fell flat. It's this Wall Street-friendly strategy that prompted Bernie Sanders to issue this rebuke of the party on Wednesday. It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working-class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change. Now, unlike Joe Biden's 2020 campaign, which actually incorporated Bernie's platform into its own, party leadership now is rejecting this critique. First, the DNC chair, Jamie Harrison, calling it straight-up BS. And today, Nancy Pelosi telling the Times of Bernie Sanders he has been a wonderful, shall we say, champion for his point of view, but his point of view is not correct when he says the Democrats have abandoned working families. The trans issue has come up quite frequently in election postmortems, thanks to a multi-million-dollar anti-trans ad from the Trump campaign. Trans Americans are not the only ones feeling the brunt of the post-election Democratic scapegoating. Similarly, Democrats won the majority of Latino Americans, but the slight shift of some Latinos to Trump has some Democrats wagging their fingers at Latinos, wondering how they could support a man promising the largest mass deportation in history. Arab and Muslim Americans are also being blamed, as Israel's war on Gaza has caused many of these voters in key swing states, as we explained, abandoning the Democratic Party. In Michigan, for example, Donald Trump won Dearborn and made huge gains in Hamtramck, the two cities which have the highest percentage of Arab Americans in America. And while we should all practice some humility and patience while trying to assess the collective decision of 145 million Americans, we should have no patience for those who want to scapegoat certain racial, religious, or minority groups for their electoral failures. For a party running against the racism of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, scapegoating minority groups for not voting Democrat in high enough numbers is not really a good look. And while millions of Americans rightfully fear the policies of the Republican Party, some of these groups have the added burden now of also fearing some Democratic Party policies as well. The truth of the matter is there is no single reason for the Democrats' failure to defeat such a repulsive candidate, and there were multiple factors at play. But there is one complaint that absolutely no one is making. Not a single party official or pundit can argue that the Democrats didn't raise enough money to compete in this race. In fact, just the opposite. Overall, the Democratic campaign and Democratic outside groups spent almost $1.8 billion, while the Trump campaign and his allies spent $1.4 billion. Which brings me to my final point. This week, 145 million American voters decided who the next president will be. But they did so in a political system, an economic system, and an information ecosystem that is dominated by a few wealthy individuals, powerful corporations, and those capable of writing $100 million worth of checks to their favorite candidates. The events of this past few weeks, including the actions of people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, have helped demonstrate that. Donald Trump is a massive and unique threat to the freedom and rights of Americans, and his victory is a major setback for our society. But there are forces larger than him that preceded his first term in office, propped him up, and will live on post-Trump: American oligarchy. During the campaign's home stretch, Democrats openly wondered whether their saving democracy message was actually working. One reason why it may not have worked is this: with the obscene amount of power so few individuals have over our lives and our political system, what democracy were Americans being asked to actually save? Kicking us off tonight is Viet Thanh Nguyen, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Sympathizer, which was recently adapted for television by HBO. He's also a professor at USC. Viet, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us. You know, in 2016, after Trump won the first time, I think the country collectively learned of this word resistance. It was on everyone's tongue, so to speak. In your piece before this election in Zeteo, you wrote that our fight is against both, no matter how we vote. And it seems you are better prepared for resistance than most of us as of today. Give me your thoughts on how this election turned out and where we go from here.
Amen. Such a pleasure to be here with you today. I thought you did a pretty good summary of the many varieties of different possibilities, but I'll just push on a couple of different things, which is that I don't think resistance is new in this country. I mean, resistance has been practiced by many different populations in this country since the very beginning of the United States. And that's one of the things I wanted to bring attention to, that Donald Trump and what he represents is nothing new in this country. We've had a long tradition of people exactly like him who demonize, who scapegoat, who use terror against numerous others. It's very easy politics of hatred and exploitation that he espouses, but it goes all the way back to the beginning of the country itself. So when we should ask indigenous peoples and African Americans whether or not they've ever been subjected to these kinds of politics before. I think they have, and they've always resisted. So the idea that we have not resisted before or that we're facing something new is something that we should dispose of. And one of the things that I think probably needs to be stressed is that the Republican Party has moved far to the right and brought the center of the Democratic Party with them. And I don't think the Democratic Party has resisted enough. That's where I think we should put some emphasis on the question of resistance, not necessarily among the people, but amongst the Democratic Party and its leadership.
Let me ask you about contradictions here, because I was very moved by some of your commentary after the election. You wrote a series of powerful posts, and you write, the United States was born from a fundamental contradiction that has never gone away. On the one hand, the beauty of democracy, opportunity, freedom, and equality. On the other hand, the brutality that made that beauty possible: colonization, genocide, enslavement, occupation, and war. What was it like following this campaign with everything going on in this country, certainly what is happening overseas? How were you processing these contradictions in real time that still exist till this day?
I'm the beneficiary of many of the beauties of this country that I listed, and I'm deeply appreciative of those things. But I think the facts are that the brutality has always been there as well. The genocide, the colonization, the enslavement. We can dispute what those mean, but they really have been there since the very beginning of the country. And when I say that Donald Trump is nothing new, what I'm saying is that the various kinds of policies and injustices that we see being enacted today are repetitions of the things that we have seen in the past. So I have talked a lot about the genocide that I believe that Israel is carrying out in Gaza with our very active support as the United States. And that type of genocidal policy is something that, again, has constituted the very history of this country. And so if we're not willing to recognize that that contradiction is a part of who we are as Americans, whether we're Democrats or Republicans, we're going to have a very hard time addressing what it is that Donald Trump symbolizes and his appeal to a significant part of the American population, not just white people, but a substantial number of people of color as well.
Do you believe that this country is becoming more polarized in a way that information silos are hard to break through and to cross in terms of speaking to people across a divide? Are we so polarized that we're beyond a point of depolarization, or if you can use that word to try to bring people back together?
I think the polarization is pretty intense. Now, I think that we should continue to make good faith efforts at having dialogue and conversation, and certainly the centrist part of the Democratic Party, from Barack Obama to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, have sought to do that. But the relative ineffectiveness of those efforts at dialogue need to be recognized. And one of the things that I think Donald Trump and the right wing of the Republican Party has done very well is not to actually engage in dialogue. They've staked out their political position very clearly. They have moved things to the right. The Democratic Party has not been able to as effectively articulate a more full-throated politics of solidarity, not just in terms of the many kinds of identity issues that you brought up and the many different kinds of diverse populations that we have, but also a full-throated defense of the economic interests of the American people, from the poor to the working class to the precarious middle class, who, no matter whether or not they're getting certain kinds of economic benefits, feel that they're losing in today's environment. I don't think the Democratic Party's leadership has been as appealing in defending those particular interests.